Good evening, everyone. It's so incredible to see you all here today. I'm really happy to have so many people interested in the subject. My name is Anna. I'm a co-chair of Enigma Study Association, and today, together with Studium Generale, we are here to present you the event Symposium on AI in Warfare and Security. As you probably know, artificial intelligence is revolutionizing the life around us, being applied in many different domains, including national security. This new frontier in both defense and offense is both promising, but also a bit scary. That's why today we invited 4 speakers in order to broaden your knowledge on the subject from different perspectives. So first of all, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lauren Gould, to Dr. Roy Lindelauf, and Dr. Peter de Kock. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Thijs Fernanda Blauw, could not make it today. However, she still recorded a video on her standpoint so that you don't miss anything. And without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for the evening. A full professor in the Department of CSAI at Tilburg University, Chair of Data Science and Military Operations at the Netherlands Ministry of Defense. He leads research on Steadfast project, developing autonomous and semi-autonomous drone swarms for military and civilian missions. Please welcome Dr. Roy Lindelauf.
Good evening, everybody. So very nice to be here. Thanks for the introduction. This night I have, I think, 20-25 minutes to walk you through the use of data science and AI in the military domain. A lot of stuff can be said about this, and looking at the time, I will glimpsing many of these things. But the way I want to do it tonight is to first, and you might not expect this, but first I want to go back in history. We are at this moment in time, and a lot of things are happening. There are a lot of talk is being held about AI in the military domain. But I want to go back in history, and I want to see, is this actually anything new that is happening right now? So after that, after I talk about history, I want to talk about the state of affairs of Europe today. I just came out of a call with the United States Army. So I just want to give some glimpses of where are we at, what is happening these days. And then I want to transition to how can AI and data science help us in this domain. What are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities? And I want to do this in a very nuanced way because there's a lot of talk about this. There's a lot of public perception about what AI is doing and what it is not doing. So I want to try to give a little bit of nuance to this. I'm not going to shy away from the difficult conversations and from the examples that are out there, but I want to give the nuance. Given the time that I have, I'll probably have to make broad steps. But if you have any questions, and I'm not sure if there's the opportunity now, but please contact me if you want to talk about anything after this. So first, I'm going to go back to the Second World War. And in the Second World War, I think it was 42, there was a situation where the Allies wanted to know how many tanks were being produced in the factories in Germany. And of course, they didn't have, like they couldn't go to the factories. They probably didn't even know where the factories were and count the amount of tanks that were being produced. But they wanted to know how many tanks were being produced. And my question to you, so think about this, is if you're an ally in the Second World War and you want to come up with this information, what would you do? What are the things that you've all seen the movies? What are the things that you might use, or what kind of information do you want to gather? Well, and this actually happened, of course. This is a very well documented historical case, so I challenge you to Google it and find it. A lot of things are written about it. But the things that they did with a qualitative analysis was if they had some Germans that they captured, they would interrogate them, and they would see if they had any knowledge about the factories and about the stuff that was happening there. Also in those days you had the electromagnetic spectrum, and of course there was interception of all kinds of messages. And all these traditional intelligence techniques were being used to make an estimate. And at that point, the estimate was that there were about 1,400 tanks being produced per month. At the same time, there was a statistician at Columbia University who was actually working with the Allies, with the Air Force. And he looked at this problem and he said, well, I look at this a little bit different. Because, of course, what is happening in the battlefield during the war, the Allies, they came up with the German tanks. The German tanks were being destroyed, and all those tanks, components are on the tank. And of course, it's not so the case that on a component, the actual serial number of a tank was being written down. But more or less, there was a code on the different parts. And you see an example of a code right there. And it was quite easy to translate, to decode this code into a serial number. So at this point, Wald found that you arrive at the following problem. And you probably all had statistics at some point in your life, so bear with me, but you have a big bag of balls, and every ball corresponds to a tank. And on the ball there is a number, and this number is the serial number of that respective tank. Now you have all these balls in the bag, and when you walk around, or when you go around the battlefield and you find a tank, then it's simply the same as picking up a ball from the bag, and then you see the number on it, so you know the serial number of that tank. And Wald actually he translated this problem into the question, how many balls are inside the bag? Because that's the amount of tanks that's being produced per month. So he did this, they did the calculations, and then they finally came up with the number of 270 tanks per month. So now here you have the statistician, and he says, well, I think it's 270, and there you have all your qualitative intelligence analysts, and they say, well, we think it's 1,400. And the answer is somewhere in between, or maybe it's even higher or lower. Of course, these days, with hindsight, we know what the answer was, and the actual answer was 276 tanks. And of course, I'm showing this example because it's a nice example, and the statistician was very close to the right answer. But I think this example illustrates very well the problem that we are facing even today. Because you have the human decision maker, and you have the machine, the statistician. These days we put statistics inside machines, we call it machine learning, and it's very advanced, but still it's statistics, more or less, or we might nod our head. But so you have the man making decisions, you have the machine making decisions, and somehow you have to find the right answer, right? You have to integrate this knowledge. You have to make use of man and machine in some sense and come up with the right answer. And this was happening in the Second World War already, and we're still looking at these problems today. And one of the things that I want to mention in this regard is the fact that these days in the public domain there's a lot of talk about the use of AI in the military domain, but most of the focus of these talks is about what you see in the right corner, in the downward corner. It's about, so you see here you have man and machine and you have strength and weaknesses, but a lot of talk is about the weakness of the machine. But if we want to do this man-machine teaming in the right way, we should consider all four of the quadrants in there. So we should look at the strengths of human decision-making, we should look at the weaknesses of human decision-making, we should look at the strengths of machines, and we should look at the weakness of the machines. And then we should make a risk-based approach to see, okay, what works best in what setting. So I want you to keep this in the back of your head when I show you the use cases that I want to talk about, because I think this is one of the things that is very important if you are talking about AI in the military domain. So this is the first point I want to make. Second, of course, because we're talking about the military domain, and this is no secret, things are happening these days in Europe, right? We have a conventional war going on in Ukraine, two state actors fighting with each other, but we also have unconventional wars going on right now in Europe, in our own countries. And I will be given some examples of this. But also, if you look at the European Union and at the boundaries of our European Union, we see Northern Africa and the western side of Africa, where 7 countries have seen coups d'etats in the last 3 years. And we see that certain state actors, the Russians, that they are using mis- and disinformation operations in a very intense way in those countries, but also in our own countries. And we have to be wary of this, because I'm talking about the use of AI in the military domain, I'm not only talking about conventional war, and I will be talking about it a little bit further on, but I'm also talking about the unconventional war, the gray zone tactics that are happening right now, right here. I think you all read the newspaper, it was maybe 1 or 2 days ago, about a plane in Lithuania, a cargo plane that crashed. Some people died. It's still not sure if this was an accident or if this was a Russian sabotage operation. But we know that, I think it was a month ago, that in Germany, in Leipzig, and also in the UK, that DHL cargo planes were being, inside the planes, they found devices that exploded, or incendiaries that caught on fire. And investigations showed that these are covert operations by the Russians. So we know that this is going on, and this is just one example. There are many, many other examples. I show them here on the screen. And this is the unconventional warfare that is going on right now. And there is a reason why this is going on in this way, because it's below the threshold of full-scale war. So the rules and the regulations with regard to this are very different than if you have a conventional war that is going on in Ukraine, for instance, right now. So this is the second point that I want to make, that I also want you to put in the back of your mind when we're talking about the use of AI in this domain. And of course, one of the questions that comes up with respect to these things that are happening every day right now is, are we prepared for this? So not only in the sense with AI and data science, but in a general sense, you here in the audience, in the Netherlands, are you prepared for this? I think if we look to our high-level executives and decision makers, they point out that we are not prepared for this. Rob Bauer, the head of the NATO military committee, the highest military commander in NATO, I think 1 year ago he stated that this is a problem and we are not prepared. The Secretary General of the Dutch Ministry of Defense recently made a statement that we are not prepared. The director of the National Counterintelligence Unit in the Netherlands, the NCTV, he also made a statement that we are not ready for this. We are not prepared. And I'm not scaremongering, and I don't want to scare you, but I'm simply pointing out the facts that you can find in the news and in the media every day. And the question becomes, given the fact that these things are happening, what can we do? And what can we do as a society? But what can we do as scientists? And I think with respect to those people working in the AI and data science field, I think that there are some things that we can do on a scientific basis. And I'll get to that in a minute, but from the Defense Department perspective with regard to AI and data science, what we can do is written down in a strategy of AI and data science, which it's shown right there, and you can find it online. It's an open source document, you can download it, and you can read it. But if you read it, then you will see that there are 5 themes that were actually important to work on. And it varies from autonomous systems to military decision-making and cyber intelligence, etc. So read the report, and then you can actually see what the Department of Defense is thinking about in the use of data science and AI in the military operations. So that's one of the things that are actually being done in this regard. The second thing is, because I'm standing here as a scientist working at Tilburg University and the Netherlands Defense Academy, if I look at the strategy, then the only thing that I have some kind of influence on, of course, is in the scientific domain. We are scientists. And I put this down here because if you think about the process of going from fundamental scientific knowledge to having actually some kind of system working in the field, it's a very, very broad perspective that you have to look at. And you can see it right here. It's called the technological readiness levels. So it goes from 1 to 9 from the amount of technological readiness with regard to the system. Science is about the technological readiness levels 1 to 3. So that's where the universities are working. Then you come to the prototyping. Then you go levels higher and higher until you are finally at in this case, the Department of Defense that is actually deploying systems. And note that to go from level 1 to level 2 to et cetera, there are a lot of laws and regulations and stuff that you have to abide to. I mean, even for scientific research, there is the NWO, there is the integrity, all the stuff that we have, the ethical review boards. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, but I just want to point this out, that to do a responsible innovation in this field, we have to think about a lot of things. And as scientists, we're mostly working in the levels 1, 2, 3. So this is the stage that I wanted to set when I start talking about the AI in the military domain. So, and when I was thinking about this presentation, I think I can do it in 2 ways. It can be, what kind of examples am I going to give? But I think a lot of you are interested in the stuff that you're reading in the media. So I was like, let me touch upon those things. I mean, I can shy away from them, but I don't want to do that. And the first thing, of course, is drones. But if you think about the use of drones in the military domain, the first thing that you have to think about is that you have conventional warfare and you have non-conventional warfare. The wars that we are seeing right now in Ukraine is a conventional war. Unconventional warfare, irregular warfare, it's like Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a big difference between these kinds of things. Because, for instance, the use of drones in irregular warfare, like in Iraq or Afghanistan, these systems are actually, there's no AI in there. So that's one of the things, first things that I want to point out. In an unconventional war, the difference is that because you do not have states that are fighting each other, but it's like with irregular fighters. So there is a little bit more difference, and the weapon of choice is the air weapon often. It can be helicopters, it can be jets, it can be anything. But AI, it does not come into play into those things, right? If you look at conventional warfare, what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, the trenches are close. It looks more like World War I intermixed with technological systems. And most of the drones that you're seeing right there is no AI in there. It's still humans operating the drones. What we're seeing is that the distance between the human operator and where the drone is being operated is increasing a little bit. But we're talking about drones that fly 10, 15 kilometers maybe, perhaps. Right, so that's one of the things that we're witnessing. And actually the amount of autonomy that can be incorporated in these kind of things protects the operators of the drones. Because if somebody is operating a drone somewhere in the field, and the enemy, especially the Russians, which are very good at electronic warfare, they can detect this and they can take out the operator very fast. So you have to move the operator a little bit further back from where the stuff and the action is happening, right? But is it so bad that we are using drones? Because I think, and that's what I presented in the beginning, you always have to think about the human and the machine, and you have to think about the alternative. Before drones, in a conventional war, the thing that would happen if you have a certain map where things are happening, and you want to take out the enemy, what is being done? Artillery is being fired on that entire square, and everything dies. And this might sound horrible to you. I mean, I find it horrible too, but this is the way conventional wars have been fought all along. And what we're seeing now is that, for instance, drones, they give us a new capacity. They increase the transparency on the battlefield. So it makes it easier to distinguish between good and bad. And it can also help that you do not need this artillery to take out an entire map region in a conventional conflict. But with the drones, you can do this in a better way. You can protect the innocent in a better way. So that's a difference. So the picture that you're seeing there, that's artillery fire on a certain area. The other thing with conventional warfare is that there is no air superiority in most of these situations. So what I mean with that is, for instance, in Ukraine, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, they have surface-to-air missiles. They have the S-300 that is pictured there. They can take out all kinds of different aircraft. So you will not see a remotely piloted drone from thousands of kilometers away. It simply is not happening because it's not possible, because of the way that the situation in a conventional war is. So these are all things that, if you look at the context, that makes that the way that drones are being used is different than in an unconventional war. And the other thing is that AI is not really coming into play yet. And maybe AI can build some kind of autonomy inside these drones in such a way that within a certain area the drone can navigate, can coordinate, can do some task allocation, can do some image recognition. Yes, that might be possible in the future, but if you read the newspapers, then everybody thinks it's already happening in a very big and large scale. But the situation is that actually building these kinds of algorithms is pretty difficult, right? So that's another point I wanted to make. Now, if you look at some of the research that we are also participating in, is if we look at drones, how can drones help our operators? How can drones help our military staff? How can we be better protected? One of the things that we were building was a drone early warning system. This is actually the other situation around. What if drones are attacking you? Can you detect the drones? Can you identify them? Can you make sure which drones are normal drones, which drones are suspicious drones, etc. We are having a collaboration with the city of The Hague, but also with American universities, where we're looking actually at drones in cities. And of course, a lot of drones are flying around in cities all day. And now these kind of systems help you, and they help the operator, because without such a system, you still have the human decision maker that has to make decisions about all the stuff that is happening around him. And these kind of systems, they can help him, and they can aid him in making better choices. Another one of the projects that actually is going to start is about an own drone swarm that you can use in a mass casualty event. So like I said, I think an hour ago I had a talk with the US Army and with other stakeholders in this, because we are participating with the Dutch military healthcare system. And a drone swarm can help in case of a mass casualty event. Because if something happened, and here you see the picture of a plane, so this is a civilian use case where a plane crashes inside a city, you have a lot of casualties. How can the drones help us? Well, if we can send them into the terrain and look for victims, and can do triage, and can send blood to the victims earlier than if we have to send our own operators in to take out those victims, then this can help. And AI can come in handy, and I just got a briefing from the US Army that they are actually getting some very good results with doing the triage already with the sensors on the soldiers. So one of the things that is also happening in the military domain is that the soldiers and the people in the field, that they have more sensors in their clothing and other kinds of sensors, which can help in doing this triage in a better way. So AI can help in that regard. And the situational awareness in general with regard to drones, of course, a drone swarm can help you gain better information and improve your knowledge about what is happening. And this knowledge can help you protect your own military operators, which I think is very important. The second topic that I want to touch upon is the decision support. I already mentioned some of these things, but a less well-known aspect of this is, for instance, in mission planning. So these days, if you look at helicopter pilots, for instance, in planning a route, they are standing around a table with a lot of aviators. They have the maps on the table. They have all kinds of information about the weather, about intel, etc. And they have to decide, what route am I going to take for my mission? And this is a very labor-intensive process. AI can help in this regard. So we're also doing research where AI systems can help the aviator and give him some kind of recommendation. And that the aviator can react to the recommendation. He says, well, I think this helps, or maybe this doesn't help. Or maybe, why did you make this choice? Please help me understand. And do this interactively. And what we hear from our aviators, that they really like systems like this, because it speeds up their own time, right? So they don't have to take hours in doing the planning of a mission, but they can shorten the mission planning, and then they have time for something else. And this speeds up the decision cycle, which actually is very important in the military regard, because you always want your decision cycle to be faster than the decision cycle of your adversary. Another thing, and I also wanted to mention that because with regard to the decision support, there is a lot of talk about the use of AI in targeting. We hear things about this in the public domain, so that's one of the things that I want to mention, is a lot of public domain knowledge about, for instance, what is happening in Gaza with Israel. And I only want to touch upon the AI aspect of that, because I also feel, I have my emotions and feelings with this, but this is not what the talk is about. But if you think about the use of AI in targeting in general, targeting is a very well-known military process where, if you leave out the AI for a moment, decision makers have to make decisions about which targets to engage with what kind of weapon and in what way. This is a very careful process. So on the right you see the NATO targeting process. It's, I actually had a talk with one of the guys who was responsible for this within NATO about this. It's a very delicate and detailed process. And depending on the collateral damage estimate that you are, so the collateral damage that you are expecting, this has an influence on who will make the decision on actually doing the targeting or not. So the higher the collateral damage estimate, the higher up the chain the decision has to be made for doing the actual targeting or not. Now, if we go to the media and to the news, of course we hear a lot about what is happening in Israel. And it appears to be the case that the individuals who are making the targeting decision, so the AI gives a recommendation, and then the individuals who are making the decision, they have little time for it, and it's very low in the chain. So these are two things I think in a process-wise are very bad, right? Still, the AI can really help you in getting a better collateral damage estimate, making a better targeting decision, and also doing a better battle damage assessment afterwards. AI may help in all of these things and improve it. But you have to think about the way you are actually setting up the process. And the process is about at what level do I say which individuals are allowed to make the choice for the targeting or not. And like I mentioned, in the NATO targeting process, this is very high up the chain. And also, what collateral damage estimate are you allowing for, in essence? And these are human decisions, and you have to think about how you do the processing, right? But still, I'm convinced that AI can help you do better collateral damage estimates and also better battle damage assessments. So that is with regard to the targeting process. So I want to give you a little bit of nuance when people are talking about it and they say, well, we should not use AI. So I really would like to have a nuanced discussion about that. In the other domain, so I'm really going fast in the different domains on how AI can help you, is the cyber and information domain. And I mentioned in the beginning that we're seeing in Europe also the mis and disinformation being spread by actors like Russia and China, etc. And also, of course, everybody knows this, they are also targeting our North Sea infrastructure, our gas pipelines, the digital infrastructure in the North Sea, and other kind of infrastructure. And we have cyber physical infrastructure, so we're building windmills, but of course they have to also be digitally connected. So we have these cyber physical systems. Now we need to protect these. Within NATO, every year exercises are being done, and we are also participating in some of those exercises where we build AI models to help the cyber operator see where actually the hacking is going on. So we build AI models that give a flag to a cyber operator so that he knows that this is a suspicious activity in the network. So if you think about it, in such an exercise, which takes 2 days, which simulates the entire world sometimes, we have financial systems, you have drone systems, maybe you have the infrastructure, digital infrastructure. More than 20 million activities are happening inside such a network for one team. So you have multiple teams, you have blue and red teams that are defending and attacking the network. And these operators, they have to look at all the stuff that is happening and then figure out where is the attack coming in, what should we do? And AI can really help you in this regard. So we did some research which actually shows that AI can really give you a flag and help the operator to say, well, this is where you should be looking at right now. And I think this is also with regard to what we're seeing at the North Sea. I showed you the picture that some of the cables are being cut, the Baltic cables. It's very worrying what is happening. So we need AI and data science to build up our resilience for these kind of systems. In the same domain, so that was more the cyber domain, also in the cognitive domain, a lot of mis and disinformation is being spread. And again, also for human decision makers, so please think back of the quadrant that I showed you. You have to think about the human strengths and weaknesses in this regard, and also the machine. And one of the strengths of the machine, of course, is that it can process a lot of data very fast, right? So if you think about mis and disinformation, on detecting mis and disinformation, of course you have fact-checking organizations that are doing this. And there are several ways in detecting these kinds of mis and disinformation. But you can think of looking at the context, the social context where actually a post is being made. You can think of the content of what is actually being written. But one of the things that we're also looking at is the propagation pattern of how the mis and disinformation, so say maybe a fake image that is being spread on Twitter, how it's spreading. And this kind of information, that machines are very well to detect these kinds of propagation patterns and reason about the propagation patterns to find out this is fake or this is true or maybe some other kind of category. And this is also not related really to the user himself and the information about the user. So you can build systems, again, that can help you in detecting this kind of information, and again, operators can use this. So it's aiding the decision maker, the human decision maker, in making better decisions. And I think I've been repeating myself on this point that always look at the human and the machine and the strengths and weaknesses. And I've been saying, and I'm going over this very fast, you know, that you can use AI, and everybody knows AI needs a lot of data, and also in the public domain, we see that there are many things that can also go wrong, right? With biases, historical bias in the data, etc., and that the machine makes mistakes. Nobody is saying that this is not true. We know that in the machine learning pipeline, there are also all different kinds of biases. But one of the things is that you can make them explicit, and by making them explicit, you can correct for that. So we have to work with these systems in a responsible way. That's more or less the point. And to do that, in the military, this is of course also recognized. Actually, the Netherlands, which finds law and regulations very important, last year, the Netherlands was the initiator of the Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit, which is a summit that is organized worldwide. So last year it was in The Hague. I think more than 70 countries were invited to talk about how we are going to use AI in a responsible manner in the military. This year we had the same conference in South Korea, where we talked with more than 90 countries, and actually a blueprint came out that stated these are the principles that we want to abide by. So at a very high strategic level regarding the governance of AI, these are the principles in the military domain that we have to abide by. And more than 60 countries actually signed this blueprint, right? So this, and you see this not only with the REAIM, but also NATO has their principles of responsible use of AI. The White House came out with a blueprint for how to use AI responsibly in the military domain. So at the very high strategic level, actors are thinking about this problem. And we're setting up governance frameworks. But this is not everything. So in the Netherlands and also in other Western countries, we're thinking about different ways to approach the idea of how to use AI responsibly in the military domain. So we're looking at the governance frameworks, but we also have to operationalize those governance frameworks. So if we look at applications, so applications that we're actually building inside the military, for instance, we are not just building something, they have to abide by these governing principles, and one of them is transparency. So you want your model to be transparent, so you want to be able to explain what the model is actually doing. So here I have an example of an object detection model, where you have it's not a tank, but it's some kind of tank that the model can recognize this tank. But we're not only happy if we have a model that can say, okay, this is a tank and this is not a tank. And maybe the model can even do it better than a human, right? But we're still not happy with that. We don't want the model only to be better than a human. We also want to be able for the model to explain why it came up with this solution. And here you see the picture on the left, and you can actually ask the model, tell me on which pixels, why did you decide that you think that this is a tank? And then of course you want your model to come up with some elements of the tank that are actually, you know, very characteristic about a tank. You don't want to come up that he identified the tank because of the tree standing behind it, right? So this is explainable AI. And these are the ways that we are operationalizing these high-level frameworks. And I'm not denying that this is a new field, so the governance frameworks are new, and to operationalize all these governance frameworks, sometimes it's difficult. You know, if I talk to the data scientists within the Defense Department, of course, they say, well, we want to do this in the right way, we're building these models, but we have these obligations, we have these frameworks, but I don't know how to translate this aspect of this framework into actually what I'm doing. And then they are looking for ways to solve that. And I think that's one of the things that we really have to be working on, you know, to finding ways of good operationalization. And that also relates to doing scientific research. So that's the last thing that I want to say. to really do this in the right way, you need to understand the fundamentals of the science of AI. And that's, I think, one of the big motivations for the Defense Department to sponsor my chair here at Tilburg University, because Tilburg University is not only working on AI and the cognitive side aspects of it, but also working on AI and understanding its role in the humanities and in society. What does AI actually mean for society? But doing it from a fundamental level. So you need to have fundamental knowledge about how these models are working. And then you need, if you understand that, then you can apply them in a responsible way inside your respective organization, whether it be defense or healthcare or whatever. So the way that we are doing it, we're participating in the fundamental research. We're doing a lot of education, so we're building up new educational programs. We're strengthening our collaborations with universities, with other knowledge institutes. And we want to reach out inside our own organization with education at bachelor, at master level, but also at the military in a very broad domain, and all the education that is being done inside our military organization, we're actually promoting this and translating this into educational packages. And the last thing is that we are also participating in what is called the ELSA Lab defense. So the ELSA Lab is a national lab which is about the ethical, legal and societal aspects of AI in the defense domain. And in that lab we are participating with ethicists, with lawyers, with people from all different kinds of backgrounds who are looking at this technology and who have the same goal and ambition, and that is to do this innovation in a responsible way, but it's irresponsible if you're not doing it, because we have, and in all likelihood, maybe within 5 or 10 years, we have to send our soldiers to the battleground. And that's also what I'm thinking about. So we can say, well, we should not do this with AI because it's not ethical, but it's also not ethical to not do it and send our soldiers to the battleground with their hands and their feet tied behind their back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lindelauf. Now, let me introduce our second speaker of the evening, an assistant professor in conflict studies at Utrecht University, leading the intimacies of remote warfare and realities of algorithmic warfare project. Her work explores the impact on AI and warfare, particularly on civilian harm. Please welcome Dr. Lauren Gould.
Hi, everybody. Seeing we've got such a great lineup of speakers, I'm going to get straight into the body of my presentation. So I'm going to do that by seeing if my slides work. First, a little trigger warning about some of the audio clips and footage that I will be showing throughout my presentation on the impact of 21st century warfare. So once you've read that, I would like to invite you to close your eyes and listen to the following audio clip, I think. And if possible, I don't know if anybody's on lighting, but maybe we could just fade the lights as well. And while you're listening, please reflect on how this makes you feel. Welcome back, everybody. What you heard there between the birds and the explosion sounds was a swarm of Perdix drones. Now, Perdix are not pre-programmed, synchronized individual drones. They are a collective organism, sharing one distributed brain for decision-making and adapting to each other like swarms in nature, but then for military purposes. Since no one operator can control all the drones, the drone swarms have to act on general instructions and determine how to carry them out collectively and autonomously. Now, I invite you to think what it felt like to hear these sounds. Now, this kind of technological innovation and deployment is in fact reality, unfortunately, for people living both in Gaza and Ukraine today. And it threatens to become the reality of wars everywhere in the future. Now, over a dozen advanced militaries have announced that they are in the business of innovating and experimenting with swarm drones, including the Dutch Ministry of Defense with their high-tech commercial partners. They have recently also gone to Ukraine to sign contracts there to offer their AI swarm drone technology to the military there. So, how have we got here to this pivotal moment in history where advanced militaries are all vying to integrate AI, algorithms and AI, machine learning into their military operations, many of which Roy has been discussing here. What I also want to do is go back a little bit in history. And I would say that these developments are not so much a revolution in warfare, but an evolution. And the integration of algorithms and machine learning build on many different strategies and technologies that have been in the making and have been deployed in the 21st century. So I'm going to show how I see algorithmic warfare as an additional form of remoteness in how advanced militaries wage war. And I will also discuss how algorithms and machine learning are speeding up warfare, something that Roy also mentioned. I'm not going to do this throughout the whole presentation. That's always the disadvantage of coming second, that you keep wanting to refer to the first speaker. But you, I'm sure, have heard lots of what Roy has said, so there are lots of similarities with what we're saying. I'm going to show how it's speeding up, has the potential to speed up warfare, but therefore also inherently increases the scale of warfare and its impact on civilian harm. And I'm going to end with some, the kind of political and ethical questions that this has raised for me as a researcher, and I hope we can engage in a nuanced debate during the Q&A. Now, so a little bit more about me. So I'm in the interdisciplinary field of conflict studies, mostly looking from a social science perspective on the changing character of warfare. And I specifically am interested in what wars are waged in my name. So as you can probably hear, I'm English. My parents are English. I was born in Australia and I've been living in the Netherlands for the last 33 years. Dus ik kan ook vloeiend Nederlands. That means that a lot of states claiming to represent me have been waging many different wars in the 21st century. So I'm not so intrigued with the fact that they are waging war, but I'm intrigued with how the character of the way that they've waged war has changed over time. And I'm specifically interested in what impact this has had in the battlefields in which they've engaged and on civilian harm, but also how it's influenced the democratic control that we have here over the wars that are waged in our name. So when I started as an assistant professor, I started to notice that the West and Western countries changed significantly in the way that they engaged in military intervention. So from about 2010, 2011, in the wake of the ground invasions and interventions in both Afghanistan and Iraq, we saw a shift away from boots from the ground, towards instead engaging in military interventions with a heavy reliance on air power, either manned or unmanned, and the training and advising and financing of local partners to actually do the fighting and the dying on the battlefield. Now, this was very much, if you look at the academic literature, they explain this shift, saying, you know, in the wake of the interventions and invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw a war fatigue amongst Western democratic constituencies like yourself. And then, so remote warfare, shifting to boots away from the ground, allowed advanced militaries, Western advanced militaries, to continue to engage in military interventions, but with very little risk to their own military personnel, and therefore it also reduced the political risk of gaining less votes when you engaged in risk-full war. Okay, so with this shift, and we can mention many different examples. So you have the US-led coalition against the Islamic State across Syria and Iraq, which the Netherlands was very involved in, the US and NATO intervention in Libya, the training and advising of many African militias and militaries across the African continent. In fact, many of those that were trained and advised engaged in the coups that Roy was talking about. And you could also say that the present way that many NATO countries are supporting Ukraine is also a case of remote warfare. So we provide intelligence, military attire, finances, we train Ukrainian forces, but we don't send our own military to the battlefield. Okay. So with this in mind, when you have this removal of boots on the ground, of course, you still have this eagerness to know about the battlefield. Now, you can do so by relying either on your local partners, so the Iraqi military or the Afghan military or militias in Syria, to provide you with human intel, or what you see from 2010 onwards is this increased reliance on surveillance technology to gather data from the battlefield. So either through satellite imagery, drone footage, the collection of metadata telephone information, or tracking online search behavior. Situational awareness, something that also Roy mentioned. And then using this data, sifting through this data to try and identify who are legitimate targets on the battlefield. So who would be part of the IS group, for instance, or Taliban. So what we also see in this same era is this shift from personality strikes to signature strikes. So personality strikes is when you know the identity of, for example, an IS military leader, you know where he lives, and then you target him when he is at home. Now, signature strikes work a little bit different. Signature strikes is saying, I don't know the identity of the person, but instead I have a list of characteristics which I believe correspond to somebody who is likely to be part of a militant group or insurgency or terrorist group, and I will strike that person based on that person ticking many of those characteristics. So we see a large rise in this way of engaging in strikes during the last 10 to 15 years. So here we see, this is a image of a drone operator, that drone operators, but also intelligence operators, sift through all this data that is collected from the battlefield, different sources of data, and try to predict which people are legitimate targets, which people are likely to be part of a militant group. For example, because they are a male between 25 and 35, based on their metatelephone data, you can see that they've been in contact with other known militant members, and or through drone footage imagery, we can see that they're carrying a Kalashnikov. Okay, so what's interesting about the type of research that I do is that I look at these changing character of warfare and how it's legitimized, how it's operationalized, and not only from the perspective of those in power, but also from the lived experiences of those using and deploying these technologies, as well as, like I said, the civilians undergoing the violent effects. So in this case, I do research among advanced militaries, but also actually in war zones across East Africa and the Middle East, in Iraq, soon to go to Afghanistan. So we see here a quote from a drone operator that immediately gives us a little bit of a glimpse into some of the challenges of, engaging in targets through remote knowing and remote targeting. And this drone operator says, people get hung up that there's a targeted list of people. It's really like targeting a cell phone. We're not going after people, we're going after their phones, in hopes that the person on the other end of the missile is the bad guy. Once the bomb lands, you know the phone is there, but we don't know who's behind it. It's of course assumed that the phone belongs to a human being who is nefarious and considered an unlawful enemy combatant. This is where it gets really shady. Now, this is quite an honest and candid reflection on some of the challenges of this way of war. Now, in general, and to a larger public, we see that a lot of Western advanced militaries and their governments often claim that these strategies and technologies, in fact, allow them to wage war in a very precise and accurate manner, being able to precisely distinguish between combatant and civilian other. Now, in reality, what we've seen in the last 10 years is, in fact, that this way of war, so the large-scale reliance on aerial bombardments in urban centres has led to many civilian casualties and a lot of civilian infrastructure being destroyed. Now, some organizations have really specialized in kind of contesting this precision narrative that has become very dominant in our understanding of how the wars that are waged in our name have an impact. And one of them is Air Wars. And Air Wars is an organization who basically has specialized in tracking and monitoring the number of civilian casualties that have occurred as a result of aerial bombardments in urban centers. Now, what's interesting about this organization is they kind of mimic the militaries that they're investigating. So they also use satellite imagery, social media posts, and they team up with local partners to get an understanding of the amount of civilian casualties that have died. So I want to show you a small video clip that illustrates how they have worked in previous operations, but it also leads us into the second part of this presentation, namely, they talk about what happens when you start to integrate algorithms and machine learning to sift through the vast amount of data that advanced militaries are now collecting about the battlefield. So when you start outsourcing that process not to a drone operator or to an intelligence operator, but in fact allowing algorithms and machine learning to sift through that data and make it actionable, and what kind of pressing questions this raises. So let's watch this film.
The power of AI can transform systems, helping track wildfires, streamline trade, or cure diseases. But when models are built on flawed data, AI systems often exacerbate rather than correct these flaws. Modern military's mechanisms for preventing civilians from being killed in war are deeply flawed. The US government has even admitted as much. For the past decade, Air Wars has been documenting where and how civilians are killed in war zones around the world. This includes a database of thousands of locations, dates, and casualty estimates for civilians killed by the US-led military coalition against the so-called Islamic State. For years, the US military systematically downplayed our evidence, accepting responsibility for just 1,400 civilian deaths, compared to a minimum of 8,200 documented by Air Wars. Then, in 2022, a series of exposés by the New York Times, building on Air Wars' documentation, used the US military's own civilian harm assessments to show how flawed the process is. By matching what the US military thought they were hitting, military targets, with the actual impact on the ground, families and children killed, the Pulitzer-winning reporting exposed the endemic flaws in the military's targeting system, leading to the wrong people being killed time and again. In response, the military launched a multi-year plan to reshape protection of civilians, Yet that process is still in its infancy and mistakes continue. Despite this, there is a rush to apply AI technologies to all parts of the military kill chain, from surveilling populations to target identification and even fully autonomous weapon systems. In Gaza, the Israeli military has reportedly used AI at unprecedented levels in various parts of the targeting process. Yet Airwars has tracked allegations of civilian harm at a rate faster than any conflict we have ever monitored. The US and other Western nations have regularly raised concerns around the rate at which civilians are being killed. In the race to integrate AI into militaries, fundamental concerns are being ignored. How can we ensure that AI reduces, rather than accelerates, misidentification and confirmation bias? Is the flawed data that led to civilian deaths in previous conflicts now being used to train AI algorithms? And if mistakes are made and civilians are killed, who is ultimately accountable for the failings of an AI system? Until these and other questions are answered, the global rush to integrate military AI risks exacerbating harm to civilians around the world.
Okay, moving on, here we go. So I'm going to come back to one of the cases that Roy also touched upon, and what was discussed in the short clip by Airwars here, because it illustrates at least one military application of AI that we're now seeing being introduced into a operation, or the operation, by IDF in Gaza. Now, this reporting is based on the work of investigative journalists, Israeli and Palestinian investigative journalists who work for magazine 972 and Local Call. A lot of my work starts with the work of investigative journalists that break certain stories, and then we as researchers pick up on them and delve into them more deeply. And that is something that we are now building a team to be able to follow up on this investigation. Now, why it's so important, this particular reporting, is because it actually gives us a glimpse into this human-machine interaction that Roy was discussing. Namely, they interviewed more than 14 IDF operators, intelligence operators, about the use of what is called AI-enabling decision-making processes, systems. So we're really looking at the role of AI in targeting here. So Roy mentioned the role of AI in many different other military domains, but we're looking into this. And these intelligence officials report on using 3 different AI-enabling decision-making systems, namely Lavender, Gospel, and Where's Daddy? Now, Lavender produces a rating expressing its prediction that someone is likely to be part of the Hamas's military arm. Gospel identifies what buildings these people are housed in, and Where's Daddy predicts when these people will be home so that they can be targeted in their family home. Now, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, this is an evolution, not a revolution in the way that war is fought. Now, these systems are based on an infrastructure that has been long in the making. So they can only work if they're based on the mass surveillance of 2.3 million people living in Gaza that collect all sorts of information and data about these individuals. Now, reporting has shown that this data is now being housed, most likely on a cloud environment created by Google and Amazon. And this is where this data is made actionable, and through algorithms and machine learning, and targets are produced. In this case, we see also that recently Palantir, which is another interesting player, who's the CEO of Palantir, has said that they are now provide software in Ukraine and actually responsible for most of the targeting that's taking place in Ukraine. But they've also aligned themselves with the Israeli IDF and are providing their software there too. So it's an interesting connection of private and state actors taking place here to create these targeting systems. There are still humans in the loop that verify the targets and then decide what hardware should be used to engage in the target. It could be F-35s, drones, or special operation forces in Gaza. So we see that this introduces a new level of remoteness. So instead of human operators going through, sifting through the large amounts of data, we see this as being outsourced to algorithms and machine learning. So these interviews give us a little bit of a glimpse into the human-machine interactions that Roy was talking about. And these are just some of the quotes from these interviews, saying that Gospel helped the IDF officers go from 50 targets a year to 100 targets a day. So we see how it really speeds up the process of making the data actionable. Lavender managed to generate 37,000 people as potential human targets, and they would invest just over 20 seconds to verify each target. And also themselves claiming that they had really rather little added human value. The emphasis was on quantity and not quality. And what's really interesting is that the elite commander of this Unit 8200 that many of these officers were part of brought out a book in 2021 under a pseudonym about the prospects of integrating AI in the military domain, and said that this would help deal with the human bottleneck for locating new targets and decision-making to approve them. So we really see this as not by default, but by design. So these AI technologies are being introduced to speed up what is seen as the human bottleneck in decision-making in these systems. Now, of course, if you speed up warfare, this is going to largen the scale of warfare, but also the scale of civilian harm. Now, in our research program, The Realities of Algorithmic Warfare, we like to move beyond just looking at body counts. Why? Because body counts, in many ways, is a very good, important starting point to understand the impact of 21st century warfare, but it also objectifies humans. It makes them objects that can be counted instead of human beings with devastating stories to tell. And it also sanitizes war. It makes us forget that war, in essence, is about death and destruction. So if we start to look at direct effects, so casualties, over 40,000, but also injuries, over 100,000, and 60% of residential areas destroyed, we can also start to understand the reverberating effects. So 1.93 million internally displaced, over 100 million on the brink of starvation, facing also electricity blackouts and no clean access to water. We can also start thinking how these forms of harm interact and compound. Now, these forms of harm are known forms. These are predictable forms of harm that occur when you use explosive weapons in urban areas, in trapped urban areas. They are unprecedented in recent history, but they're predictable. Now, I think when it comes to research, I think some of what our focus should also be on is the new forms of harm that this particular way of war introduces. So as I said before, these systems only work if they're based on the mass-scale surveillance of civilians. And this, we know, undermines human rights worldwide and privacy regulations and laws. We also have to, I think, the data scientists and computer scientists in the room, I'd really invite you to think through how are these algorithms, machine learning systems being programmed? What characteristics are being coded into the algorithms that say this makes people, a person, most likely to be part of a militant arm? What we see from the interviews is characteristics like being in a WhatsApp group with a militant, no militant member, or if people change SIM cards or change their phones often, or if people change address often. Now, having done research in war zones, I know from first-hand experience that this is pure survival mechanism, right? Survival behavior. What do you do when you're being bombed or your house has been destroyed? You move on. You pass your phone on to your family members to help them survive. So we have to think through, are these characteristics and these survival behaviors actually increasing the likelihood that civilians are being targeted once again? So coming full circle back to the audio clip that we started off with, I think we have to think through how AI in targeting processes, if we talk about increasing the speed of warfare, then inherently we're talking about, increasing the amount of deaths and injuries and destruction, levels of destruction. But we argue that, in fact, the compounding effects of algorithmic warfare is a psychic imprisonment, where people know they are under constant surveillance, yet do not know which behavioral or physical features will be acted on by the machine. Something I think we can all need to think through and do much more research on. So to conclude, the algorithmic turn, I argue, introduces new kinds of distancing, where data, the processing and making data actionable is outsourced to algorithms and machine learning. This inherently, what we're seeing is that this increases the speed of warfighting, something that's often used also to legitimize the use of these technologies, but inherently, therefore, also the scale of civilian harm and reinforces new and compounding forms of harm that need further investigation. It is apparent that our focus should not solely be on the technical prowess of AI systems or the figure in the loop as a failsafe. We must also consider these systems' ability to alter the human-machine-human interaction, where those executing algorithmic violence are merely rubber stamping the output generated by the AI systems, and those undergoing the violence are dehumanized in unprecedented ways. The legitimacy and the future of these technologies is how they are giving meaning now. We just had reports that the Dutch have spent nearly 1 billion euros on buying military attire from Israel in just the last year. Israel is one of the biggest exporter of military hardware and software in the world. Advanced militaries across the world will be watching this space and how these technologies are made actionable and put to use and at what consequence. So the time now, I think, is to have critical research and nuanced debate about the future of these technologies. And I hope we can start that here tonight, together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gould. And now I would like to welcome our third speaker of today, Professor of Practice in Data Science, Crime and Safety at Tilburg University and the Hieronymus Academy of Data Science, specializes in AI crime prediction and security. With a background in filmmaking, he creates a very interesting AI standpoint. Please welcome Peter de Kock.
Thank you very much. To be able to tell you, to appreciate what I'm going to talk to you about, I have to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a filmmaker by profession, and I've been making films across the world in many war-torn countries, and I've been doing so for 15 years, and then I've been arrested at least 20 times that I can remember in countries like Yemen or Chechnya or Sierra Leone or Colombia. And then I changed my profession. I became a law enforcement officer. I went to work for the Dutch National Police, and I started off in the clandestine part of the Dutch National Police. And I earned my place there by writing a thesis. And the thesis was called, Can we use scenarios as they are used in the film industry to better anticipate criminal behavior? And that worked in practice. And I developed a very small module, if you will. And with that module and the data that we had, we were able to predict and thwart a terrorist attack in the Netherlands. And that was the start of my career within the police force, but it was also the start of my academic career, because I was asked to earn my PhD on that specific subject. Can we use scenarios as they are used in the film industry to better anticipate criminal behavior? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Now I'm a professor at the university, professor of practice at JET, Euronymous Academy of Data Science. And basically, I think the question you should ask is intelligence. What is intelligence? We have more than enough data or information, but how do we get from data or information to intelligence? Now, this is a small formula, if you will, that I often use. Intelligence is a combination of information and knowledge. And in and by itself, it's not a very interesting equation. But if you turn it around, it becomes one, because the combination of information, knowledge and information becomes intelligence, is an equation by which you can combine past with the present into the future. Because we learn from things that happened in the past, obviously. Information, here and now, I used to be head of the undercover unit of the Dutch National Police, and we were putting people in a criminal organization so that they could assess what's happening here and now within that specific criminal organization. But having that information position is not nearly as efficient if you don't know how to combine the information from here and now with the knowledge from the past. And only if you're able to do that, so combine knowledge from the past with information about the present, you can move into the future. You can move into the realm of intelligence. This slide is, the only reason for this slide is to show you, and this is, I think, the takeaway lesson for my presentation, you cannot underestimate the power of a narrative. Never underestimate the power of a narrative. Narratives are the things that makes us humans relate to one each other. It's also one of the things that make us fight one another. And history, the word story is in history, right? So it's that important. Without a story, there is no history, you could say. And tonight, if we watch the complex news, the whole world is brought to us in quite literally in the form of a narrative. And quite recently, we've become aware of the value of truth in narratives. Now, the next question you should ask is, what makes a narrative? Now, this is a lesson that I learned in film school. Every single narrative can be told by a limited number of components. And there are only 12. And with these 12 components, you can tell every single story that's imaginable. It doesn't matter if it takes place in ancient Greece or modern day Amsterdam. Every story only has 12 components. And as you can see, the first 10 of those, I've given a hexagon format, hexagon figure. And that's because you cannot mix them up with one another. So arena is a completely different thing from motivation. And the protagonist of a story is a completely different thing than means or modus operandi. However, there are two circles, as you can see, red herring and symbolism. Red herring is a term that was coined by Alfred Hitchcock, the filmmaker. And red herring is basically, suppose I'm a writer and you're the readers, and I would want you to believe that the gardener did it, then I would put a rake in my story. And then you would all think, it's probably the gardener. Well, in fact, it was somebody else, right? Then the rake is a form of a red herring, a false clue, basically. Now, false clue and symbolism, that's why we've given them a circle, are not standalone components. So while the first 10 of these components you cannot mix up, red herring and symbolism are components that attach themselves to other components. I earned my PhD in researching terrorism. And I can quite confidently say that I have found a way to eradicate terrorism. And that is just take out symbolism. Because symbolism and terrorism are intricately related. Without symbolism, there is no terrorism. If you look at the attacks on the Twin Towers, or the terraces in Paris, or the attack in Christchurch, then you see that symbolism attaches itself to the component of arena, because the terraces in Paris stand for something larger. So symbolism and terrorism are very closely knit, are very closely connected. This is basically the very simple way of looking at the world, only 12 components. Well, in fact, there are many sub-layers lying underneath. And that's where we enter the domain of data science. For instance, the means to execute an attack, I could execute an attack with a knife, or a rope, or a firearm. And a firearm you can subdivide into automatic weapon and handgun. And handgun you can further subdivide into pistol and revolver, and a revolver you can subdivide into make and brand and serial number. So underneath these 12 top-level components, if you will, lie many, 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 many levels of subcomponents. And what we did is we wrote down, we created all the levels of subcomponents by which you can model criminal behavior. And the way we did this is by using an ontology. And I'm sure most of you understand the difference between a taxonomy and an ontology. But for the people that do not know these terms, a taxonomy basically is the way an organization is structured. So you have a director, and the director has teams, and the teams have people in the teams. And so that way of writing down an organization is basically a taxonomy. It's a very simple, set in stone way of looking at the world. There's a taxonomy of humans, there's of animals, for instance. Now, an ontology is able to harvest many, many, many different taxonomies. And it's also able to harvest dynamic relations. So for instance, if the head of the company or the chief of the company lives at the same village as one of the team members, that's a relationship that can change over time, right? That's very hard to put in a taxonomy. In ontology, that's a completely different thing. So the ontology is dynamic, that's what you have to remember, and it is able to encompass many different taxonomies. Now what we did is we create automatically the narrative of every single criminal effect, any single criminal event. And that looks something like this. This is a graph that we automatically can create, and especially this day and age we can use large language models to detect specific components of the 12 elementary scenario components, and we put them in a graph. This is a three-dimensional graph, a point cloud, if you will. And normally, I show you this for two reasons. First, you can understand that this is far too complex for us humans to understand. We don't think like this. This, in fact, is the graph that we created of all the data that we could find about the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. So this is built on newspaper articles, on Twitter feeds, on news reports, on police reports. And out of all that data, we created this graph. Now, if later grandchildren would ask you, what was the situation with the Charlie Hebdo attacks? We as humans can relate a story, we can make a story, we can tell a story to our grandchildren. But this is way too complex for us to understand. The other reason why I would like to show this to you is that every single component is related. So if I were to put on a data point here, something top right would move. Barely, but measurably. What you can do with this is anticipate behavior. What we did as a test, we took from the police 13.5 million police reports. And we translated those into 13.5 million of these graphs. And after we did that, we were able, because the structure of this graph is always the same, that's good to understand. The structure is always the same, but obviously every criminal event has a different form, but the structure is always the same. And because that structure is the same, we can compare and contrast different incidents to one another. And that's something that is impossible to do as a human. You cannot read 13.5 million police reports during your working life, let alone understand them, remember them, and take value out of them. That's something, coming back to the 4 quadrants, that's something that machines can do far better than humans. Coming back to the structure, so you have these 12 components, and now we're on a very high abstraction level, and you know the thing that's lying underneath. You could argue that if you already have the new or the scenario of the future, because you know all the components, all the 12, but all the layers lying underneath, but you don't know what will happen in the future because it's still, nothing is known. And you can imagine that in the realm of terrorism research, it would be very comfortable and very interesting to have a historic data set with all kinds of terrorist incidents, all structured on the same way, all the same structured data graphs. Now, the data that we normally use is client data. We do this for the Dutch National Police in terrorism research, and we used their data. Typically, data, client data in general, has a high resolution because it's verified, but it has a lower volume, especially compared to open source data. In my research, I used more than 200,000 terrorist attacks. So the volume is much higher than that we had at the police when I was working there. There were not 200,000 terrorist attacks that are in the databases of the police. But obviously, the resolution of the open source data is significantly less because there are mistakes there, there's misinformation there, there's disinformation there maybe even. Now, when I was doing this research, somebody said to me, well, okay, that's interesting, but we all know that terrorists in general are more creative than police organizations, right? The people working at the police. So how do you get creativity into your model? How do you get innovation into your model? And I thought about that for a couple of weeks, and then I thought, hang on, this whole approach is based on the creative scenario, right? So why not introduce creative scenarios? And that's when I started with the creative data set. And that's a data set of all films, movies, poems, writings about terrorism. I started with the complete works of Frederick Forsyth. I took all the novels, 17, and I automatically text and data mined them and made graphs out of them, data graphs. So from that point onwards, we were able not only to compare, let's say, the Charlie Hebdo attacks to the 9/11 attacks, but also the Charlie Hebdo attacks to Dogs of War, or 24, the television series. And then we found out that more often than we thought, terrorists get inspired by things they see on television, or books they read, or even poems that they send to each other. This was back in the day of IS, and IS had this magazine in which was a glossy actually, very well made glossy, and they send it through internet. And they had poems there and stories there and ways to make bombs, and they all published that. We also used these glossy magazines and put them in the creative data sets. So now we have data that not only is historic and is in one of the two bottom data sets, but it's also data or events that did not take place, but were thought of by creative people. And then we thought of the last level, the fourth level, and this was the level of artificial intelligence. Obviously, there's a lot of artificial intelligence on different levels, and we can speak about that later. But this specific part of artificial intelligence generates knowledge rules, knowledge graphs, to be precise, out of the data sets that are in the system. And it creates new data sets according to the knowledge rules that it finds. So now we're at a point in time in which we do not only have data of historic events, not only data about historic events and things that didn't take place but were thought of by creative people, but also data of events that never took place, never were thought of by any human being, but were created by the machine. So in theory, we're now entering the point that it becomes for a terrorist organization very hard to think of something new. The only thing we have to do now is to define what's going to happen and where do we get the data from. This is obviously one use case, and terrorism research is one use case. We now use this also for the Dutch National Police, for KLM when they have to transport goods from one place to the other. In health, you can use it for many, many different purposes. And this is a very abstract way of looking at data and the way we use that.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Thais Fernanda Blaut. I am currently working at the University of Groningen, and it's a pity that I couldn't be there with you today, but I'm glad that the organizing team allowed this possibility of contributing with some ideas through this video. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some ethical and legal implications of the use of AI in warfare, which is also the topic of my PhD dissertation. So the first thing that I would like to contribute and the first thing that I would like to mention is one very relevant legal and ethical idea, which is the principle of human dignity. Human dignity is this principle that is the basis of international human rights law, and even though it might not be present in all pieces of legislation when it comes to human rights, it is known as to form the basis of it, as the basic understanding on why we want to respect and have human rights protected. It is a principle that started to be more well developed and also discussed after the Second World War, because we of course learned from the experience and want to avoid things like that happening again. And in some national constitutions it is present as a principle explicitly as well. So it's not just in international human rights law, but also in national constitutions, not all of them, but in many. And the main concern here when it comes to human dignity is that AI systems used in warfare, especially when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, they may dehumanize warfare, because these systems, as advanced as they might be, they are not able to see the person on the other end of the attack as a human, as a moral subject. It only sees the person as a data point. So people become data points, they become targets that need to be attacked without any consideration, without any type of empathy or any ability to value the human life beyond that statistical calculation that is being made. So this type of detachment from people to people may risk trivializing this act of killing, making warfare sometimes seem a little bit like a video game, which was also an issue that was already discussed during the Iraq War with the use of drones. We have people sitting in an office with air conditioning, just sitting there very well, commanding attacks with the drones. And with the AI system, we might not even have that. So we really have this detachment between the attacker and the targets. And furthermore, something that we have also seen quite often is with AI systems in general, in civilian applications as well, is that data and algorithms might have biases, they might be faulty, they might present errors, and errors when it comes to use of AI in warfare represent the loss of lives. So we could be seeing wrongful targeting, for example, and those types of big, high-stakes environment problems going on. And then without having this meaningful human oversight over the systems, we can risk scenarios in which foundational human rights principles could be violated. And that also comes to these operational challenges, because we do have, when it comes to operational aspects, we do have opportunities and risks. I do not want to say that we only have risks with the use of AI. However, because we have, for example, AI systems that could enhance military efficacy, we could have AI systems being used to help strategizing. So we do have all these things considered. But also, we could have a scenario in which we have unpredictable conflict zones. We have the risk of escalation, and we also have the risk of having a scenario in which we have prototype warfare. And what that means is that perhaps new technologies, using AI especially, might be used in the battlefield for the purposes of testing. So we have these untested technologies being deployed in real-world conflicts because of time pressure sometimes that we have in wars. And this has been already observed in Ukraine, in which advanced drones simply failed to meet the operational demands they were designed for. So using conflicts as testing grounds not only risks operational failure, but also endangers civilian lives, highlighting this urgent need for more accountability and regulation. Endangering civilians is also something that international humanitarian law has long stated that is not possible. Through the principles of discrimination and proportionality, we should not have civilians being attacked in conflict zones. So one proposed solution that I would like to suggest, and also has been suggested within the United Nations framework and by different countries in these meetings in which they discuss the regulation of autonomous weapon systems, is the principle of meaningful human control. This principle goes a step further than having human in the loop. It really raises the issue and the necessity of having a human who can actually look at the context and make a decision that is not just a pressing of a button. That human needs to have information, needs to have access to context, needs to have sufficient time to make a decision, even though it seems quite difficult to have that during war. But that is necessary to have at least that moral enactor behind a killing using autonomous weapon systems or AI in weaponry. So life and death decisions through this principle would not be made by algorithms alone, but by a human who is actually there to preserve this ethical integrity in military operations. And this is also something that could help reduce this dehumanization of warfare, ensuring that technology advancements do not undermine our fundamental human values. So just to conclude, this very broad and few ideas that I just mentioned, it's important to prioritize ethical governance. It's important to think about what the use of this technology mean beyond what is operational, what is through this view of operations could be beneficial, but also look into how ethical governance and legal safeguards could be put in place in order to prevent us from having a dehumanization in warfare. Thank you very much for your attention. If you would like to discuss any of the issues that I mentioned, you can please reach out by email. I'll be happy to discuss them with you. And I wish you a nice rest of the event. Thank you very much.